Cedar Flats, Nebraska Territory, May 1857. While other settlers rushed to enclose their homesteads with quick wooden rail fencing, Thomas Caldwell continued methodically placing limestone blocks around his property's perimeter, marking the 11th week of construction. His neighbors called it excessive. They called it foolhardy. He was building a wall that stood 5 feet high and 3 feet thick, surrounding his entire 80-acre claim with 320 ft of continuous stone barrier. The massive structure required an estimated 17 tons of limestone, hauled painstakingly from a quarry 3 miles distant. Edward Peterson, whose own homestead was enclosed by the standard split-rail fence requiring just 6 weeks of labor, watched Caldwell place another perfectly cut block and shook his head. "That wall's consuming more time than building your house and barn combined," Peterson called out, leaning against his wagon. "A man could plant and harvest half a season's crops with those hours." Settlement founder William Harrison, whose 3 previous homesteads across Illinois and Iowa had taught him efficient frontier resource allocation, studied Caldwell's progress with open skepticism. 3 feet thick is triple what any wall needs for marking property, Harrison observed to the small gathering of neighbors. Even the government fort doesn't waste stone like that. The mathematical burden of Caldwell's project became increasingly apparent as spring advanced. Where standard rail fencing required approximately 4 cords of timber and 3 weeks of labor, his limestone perimeter demanded 17 tons of quarried stone and a projected 14 weeks of backbreaking work. The additional 11 weeks represented planting time lost, delayed field clearing, and postponed well digging that other settlers considered essential first-year priorities. James Mitchell, who had survived 3 prairie fires during his 12 years in the territories, regarded the wall with particular derision. "I've seen prairie fires jump creek beds 30 feet across," he told anyone within earshot. "Think stone's going to save you when wind drives flames higher than your cabin roof?" The criticism intensified as neighboring families completed essential spring planting, while Caldwell continued his methodical stonework. Peterson's homestead already showed neat rows of emerging corn across 5 broken acres. Harrison's property featured a newly constructed equipment shed and expanded vegetable garden. Mitchell had added a second sod house for his growing family and enclosed 3 additional acres for wheat cultivation. Yet Caldwell persisted with quiet determination that puzzled his neighbors. When questioned about his methods, he offered only brief explanations that revealed knowledge sources unfamiliar to most prairie settlers. "Limestone doesn't burn," he told Peterson during one of their conversations. "Fire needs 3 things: fuel, air, and a continuous path. Break anyone, you control the fire." The explanation seemed simplistic, but Caldwell's confidence stemmed from experiences his neighbors lacked. The technical specifications of Caldwell's wall became community conversation throughout late spring. Each limestone block averaged 70 pounds and measured 16 inches long by 10 inches wide by 8 inches high. Unlike conventional dry-stacked stone used for field clearing and property marking, Caldwell employed mortared construction with precisely cut blocks. The 3-foot thickness at the base tapered slightly to 30 inches at the top, creating a structure designed to withstand both physical impact and extreme heat. As June approached and the first distant smoke smudges appeared on the western horizon, the contrast between Caldwell's incomplete wall and his neighbors' established homesteads became increasingly stark. Peterson was already tending thriving crops, while Harrison's expanded garden promised vegetable abundance by midsummer. Mitchell had completed a new chicken coop and smokehouse, while expanding grazing areas for his small cattle herd. Caldwell, meanwhile, continued placing stone with methodical precision that ignored community pressure and approaching planting deadlines. His 17 tons of carefully selected limestone represented not just months of extra labor, but a fundamental disagreement with accepted prairie settlement practices. The massive fire barrier he was creating would either vindicate his unconventional approach or prove his neighbors correct about the folly of sacrificing immediate agricultural progress for unproven protection theories, learned in the quarries of Pennsylvania and the fire-ravaged forests of his youth. By mid-June 1857, Thomas Caldwell's wall had progressed to the halfway point, revealing construction techniques that went far beyond simple stone stacking. Each limestone block was placed according to a precise system developed during his 15 years as a Pennsylvania quarryman. The masonry technique featured a modified Flemish bond pattern with alternating headers and stretchers, creating a structure with exceptional stability and heat resistance. The mortar composition, a carefully balanced mixture of lime, sand, clay, and water, had been refined through Caldwell's experiences rebuilding chimneys and fire breaks in Philadelphia's Kensington district following the devastating fires of 1844. Limestone absorbs approximately 0.21 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit, Caldwell explained to James Mitchell, who had stopped to examine the wall despite his previous skepticism. With 17 tons in place, this barrier can absorb and dissipate over 7,000 BTUs during a fire event without significant structural degradation. Mitchell's expression revealed both confusion and reluctant interest in calculations he couldn't dismiss but didn't fully understand. William Harrison approached the technical conversation with more practical concerns. "That's fascinating, Caldwell. But how does thermal absorption translate to real protection when flames are leaping 20 feet high and embers are raining down a half-mile ahead of the fire front?" Harrison's question cut to the central issue: whether theoretical properties would translate to practical protection during the chaos of an actual prairie conflagration. Caldwell responded by pointing out key design elements invisible to casual observation. The wall height of 5 feet had been specifically calculated to exceed the average flame height of grass fires by approximately 12 inches, creating a barrier against the most common fire spread mechanism. The 3-foot thickness exceeded by 200% the thermal penetration capacity of intense blazes, based on calculations from eastern forest fires. Most significantly, the 60-foot setback from all structures created a defensible zone where secondary protection measures could be implemented during an active fire event. The economic burden of Caldwell's approach became increasingly apparent as summer progressed. Edward Peterson calculated the opportunity cost during one evening gathering at Harrison's cabin. 14 weeks of wall building represents 840 man-hours of labor, Peterson explained to the assembled settlers. In that same time, a man could break and plant 8 acres, build 2 outbuildings, dig a well, and still have time for community barn-raising participation. The mathematical reality was stark. Caldwell's homestead development lagged significantly behind neighbors who had prioritized immediate agricultural productivity. Dutch immigrant Frederick Janssen, whose family had survived 3 generations of farming the fire-prone polders of Holland, expressed particular skepticism. "My grandfather taught us to use controlled burns and 20-foot fire breaks," Janssen explained during an August community meeting. Simple ditches and backfires have protected Dutch farms for centuries without wasting stone that could build 3 root cellars and 2 spring houses. The knowledge sources behind Caldwell's innovation gradually emerged through conversations with interested neighbors. His father, Samuel Caldwell, had served as battalion chief for Philadelphia's Franklin Fire Company during the 1830s, developing building protection strategies during an era when urban conflagrations regularly destroyed entire city blocks. German stonemasons had shared fire-resistant construction techniques during Caldwell's apprenticeship years, demonstrating how specific masonry patterns could withstand extreme heat while maintaining structural integrity. Most significantly, during his westward journey, Caldwell had observed Pawnee fire management techniques that combined physical barriers with strategic placement of protective structures. By late August, wisps of smoke appeared with increasing frequency on the western horizon. Small, lightning-sparked fires consumed patches of prairie 20 miles distant, their nighttime glow a reminder that theoretical debates about fire protection would eventually face practical testing. The unusual dryness of the summer had created ideal conditions for fire propagation. Knee-high grasses had cured to perfect tinder, and 3 months with rainfall 40% below normal meant even natural fire breaks like creek beds and river margins provided diminished protection. As September brought even drier conditions, Caldwell worked with increasing urgency to complete his wall. The final limestone blocks were set in place during the third week of the month, creating a continuous barrier exactly 320 feet in circumference, enclosing his cabin, barn, well, and primary agricultural fields. The completion arrived precisely as the first substantial fires of the season began advancing from the territories to the west. October 1857 brought the first opportunity to test Caldwell's stone barrier under controlled conditions. With 4 neighbors observing from a safe distance, Caldwell ignited a small demonstration fire 20 yards west of his property. The carefully managed blaze consumed a 10-foot square of dry grass, generating flames that reached 3 feet in height and temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit at the combustion point. Watch how the fire behaves when it reaches different barriers, Caldwell instructed, pointing to 3 test sections he had prepared. The first section featured standard wooden rail fencing, the second a 6-foot-wide dirt fire break, and the third a small segment of his limestone wall extending 8 feet outward from the main structure. As the flames approached the wooden fence, the results were immediate and dramatic. Fire climbed the dry rails within seconds, transforming them from barrier to fuel. Within 4 minutes, the entire fence section was consumed, leaving only smoldering posts and a path for fire to continue spreading. The dirt fire break performed better, stopping direct flame contact, but allowing wind-blown embers to cross and ignite grass beyond the gap. When flames reached the limestone section, the contrast in performance became starkly evident. The stone absorbed heat without ignition, creating a true barrier that fire could not penetrate or climb. Using a metal temperature gauge, Caldwell demonstrated that while the fire-facing side of the wall reached 215 degrees, the protected side remained just 85 degrees. Most impressively, no burning embers crossed the 5-foot height, proving the wall's effectiveness as a complete fire barrier. "That's all well and good for your tiny test fire," James Mitchell commented. "But that's not how real prairie fires behave. When a wall of flame 40 feet high comes roaring at you faster than a horse can gallop, no stack of rocks will save you." Edward Peterson nodded in agreement. "I've seen fires jump the Platte River when the wind is high. Your wall might stop a campfire, but nature has other ideas." Despite these dismissals, the demonstration sparked interest among some observers. Frederick Jansen asked detailed questions about the mortar composition and heat conduction properties, while Harrison measured the wall's dimensions with newfound attention to its proportions. Through November and early December, Caldwell continued refining his fire defense system. He added a secondary preparation to the wall's effectiveness by clearing a 20-foot strip of land around the entire outer perimeter, creating a compound defense combining a fuel-free zone with the thermal barrier. Metal shields were installed at critical points where wooden structures came nearest to the wall, providing additional protection against radiant heat. Most significantly, he established a water reserve system with 4 80-gallon barrels positioned strategically inside the perimeter, ensuring firefighting capability if embers breached the main barrier. The winter of 1857-1858 provided theoretical validation as small grass fires continued to flare across the territory. Each incident brought reports of defensive successes and failures that Caldwell methodically documented in a leather-bound journal. Rail fences required replacement after nearly every fire event, regardless of intensity. Dirt fire breaks proved inconsistently effective, highly dependent on width and wind conditions. Most concerning, standard defensive measures failed catastrophically during higher-intensity burns driven by strong winds. Spring 1858 arrived with unusual weather patterns that postponed the anticipated testing of the settlement's various fire defenses. Heavy March rains saturated the prairie, creating lush growth but temporarily reducing fire dangers. April brought additional precipitation, raising creek levels to 10-year highs and transforming fire breaks into muddy trenches that required constant maintenance. The unexpected moisture prompted community confidence that perhaps the coming fire season would prove mild. Peterson expanded his agricultural fields to within 15 feet of his cabin, prioritizing crop yield over defensive space. Harrison constructed a new wooden equipment shed directly adjacent to his main barn, ignoring the recommended 50-foot separation that fire-conscious settlers typically maintained. Even Mitchell reduced his defensive preparations, focusing instead on expanding livestock holdings with newly acquired cattle. Caldwell alone maintained vigilant preparation, recognizing that the abundant spring growth would eventually cure into unprecedented fuel loads. Each additional inch of prairie grass represented potential energy that could feed fires of exceptional intensity when summer heat inevitably returned. The unusual rainfall, he explained to increasingly complacent neighbors, was not a reprieve but rather the foundation for potentially catastrophic conditions later in the season. By late April, with green growth stretching horizon to horizon and streams still running high, the delayed fire season had created a dangerous complacency throughout the settlement. Defensive preparations waned as agricultural expansion took precedence, setting the stage for a reckoning when conditions inevitably changed. The summer of 1858 brought a dramatic reversal of the spring's unusual moisture patterns. By early June, rainfall measurements had plummeted to just 0.4 inches monthly, 65% below normal for the Nebraska Territory. July continued the trend with only 0.3 inches recorded, creating drought conditions that rapidly transformed the prairie's lush growth into a sea of tinder. Temperatures climbed steadily, with 17 consecutive days exceeding 95 degrees Fahrenheit by midsummer, further drying vegetation already stressed by moisture deficits. William Harrison called an emergency community meeting on July 18th, as the first significant fires of the season appeared 30 miles southwest of the settlement. "We're facing unprecedented conditions," Harrison explained to the assembled families. The spring rains created grass growth averaging 36 inches high across the territory. That's nearly double normal height, and it's now curing into the heaviest fuel load I've seen in 15 years on the prairie. The mathematical reality was sobering. Dry grass at 36 inches represented approximately 4.8 tons of fuel per acre, compared to typical loadings of 2.5 tons in normal years. This 92% increase translated directly to potential fire intensity, with flame heights and advance rates proportionally elevated. Most concerning, the continuous nature of the unusually thick growth eliminated natural breaks that had historically slowed fire progression. "I'm doubling my fire break width immediately," Mitchell announced, recognizing the escalating danger. "Going from 20 to 40 feet, and I recommend everyone do the same." Several families nodded in agreement, already planning expanded defensive measures for their homesteads. Jansen described techniques from his homeland, explaining how Dutch farmers created wetline defenses by flooding ditches around their properties. "With water levels dropping, that may not be possible," he acknowledged, "but we can prepare mud mixtures to coat wooden structures when fires approach." By early August, smoke plumes appeared with alarming frequency on the western horizon. A fire on the 4th consumed 6,000 acres, just 25 miles distant, its glow visible through the night, as settlers watched with growing apprehension. August 17th brought an even larger conflagration that destroyed 3 isolated homesteads 15 miles southwest, reportedly advancing at speeds approaching 15 miles per hour, under wind conditions similar to those common in early autumn. These nearby incidents created the first wave of partial adaptations to Caldwell's methods. Peterson began constructing stone barriers around his most vulnerable structures, though using smaller stones stacked without mortar to expedite completion. Harrison incorporated limestone bases for wooden fence sections closest to his cabin, creating hybrid barriers with improved fire resistance. Even Mitchell, the most vocal critic, began hauling stone to protect his family's sleeping quarters, though maintaining that full walls are still excessive for any practical man. The science behind fire behavior became increasingly relevant as conditions worsened. Wildfire experts traveling through the territory explained that prairie fires typically advanced with primary flame lengths of 2.5 times the fuel height, meaning the current 36-inch grass could generate flames reaching 7 to 9 feet high. Wind conditions could increase these heights while accelerating ember production and transportation, with documented cases of burning materials traveling over half a mile ahead of main fire fronts. 3 close encounters in late August and early September demonstrated both the escalating danger and the limitations of conventional defenses. On August 27th, a fast-moving fire approached within 2 miles of the settlement's western edge before shifting winds drove it northward. Peterson's expanded dirt fire breaks showed signs of potential failure as embers easily crossed the gaps during testing with small controlled flames. Harrison's hybrid stone and wood fencing performed inconsistently, with wooden sections requiring constant monitoring during even minor exposures to heat and flames. September 12th brought another fire to within sight of the settlement, consuming 4,000 acres just 3 miles distant, before burning itself out against a creek, swollen by unexpected overnight rain. The close call prompted intensified preparations, with families creating emergency evacuation plans and consolidating valuable possessions for quick transport if necessary. Water reserves doubled throughout the community as residents recognized that firefighting capabilities might determine survival. Most telling was the community's changing attitude toward Caldwell's wall. Visitors to his homestead increased markedly, with technical questions replacing earlier ridicule. How deep should foundation stones be placed? What mortar mixture provided optimal heat resistance? How much limestone was required for minimal protection of critical structures? The inquiries reflected growing recognition that conventional wisdom might prove inadequate against the approaching fire season's unprecedented threats. By late September, the settlement existed in a state of constant vigilance. Nightly fire watches rotated among families, with elevated observation points established to provide early warnings. Children received detailed evacuation instructions, practicing emergency responses until they became automatic. The prevailing question was no longer if fire would reach the settlement, but when, and whether traditional defensive measures could withstand forces amplified by the season's extraordinary conditions. October 3, 1858, began with an ominous blood-red sunrise barely visible through dense smoke that had settled overnight across the Cedar Flats settlement. By mid-morning, the western horizon had disappeared entirely behind a wall of roiling black clouds rising 12,000 feet into the atmosphere. Harrison burst into the community gathering at Yanson's property, his horse lathered from a hard ride. "It's coming directly toward us," he announced, voice tight with urgency. The Miller family just rode in from 12 miles west. They abandoned everything after watching the Hopkins and Taylor homesteads burn in less than 10 minutes each. The fire front stretched an estimated 8 miles wide, advancing at speeds between 12 and 15 miles per hour, under 25 miles per hour, winds gusting to 40. "We have 3 hours at most," Mitchell calculated. "Everyone implement your emergency plans immediately." Families scattered to their homesteads, beginning frantic final preparations. Women gathered essential possessions, while men soaked roofs and outer walls with precious water reserves. Children herded livestock into creek beds and areas where vegetation had been completely cleared away. Peterson's expanded 40-foot fire breaks seemed woefully inadequate as reports arrived describing flame heights exceeding 15 feet and ember showers igniting spot fires half a mile ahead of the main front. His hurriedly constructed stone barriers, just 2 feet high and 18 inches thick, lacked both the mass and height to block the approaching inferno. By noon, with smoke thickening and breathing becoming difficult, he loaded his family into their wagon and abandoned their homestead. Harrison implemented more aggressive defenses, including wet burlap shields over windows and complete saturation of all wooden structures. His hybrid stone and wood fencing had been reinforced during the previous week, with gaps plugged using moistened clay. Despite these preparations, his confidence visibly wavered as temperature readings showed ambient heat rising to 95 degrees even before the fire arrived. By 12:30, he too evacuated, driving his wagon toward the creek 2 miles east, where families were gathering. Mitchell held out longest among those with conventional defenses, having invested heavily in an elaborate system of fire breaks, trenches, and pre-positioned water barrels. His family worked frantically to clear additional vegetation, creating a 60-foot defensive zone around essential structures. The approaching roar grew steadily louder, and ash began falling like gray snow across their property. At 1:15, with the main fire just 2 miles distant, and spot fires igniting within sight of their cabin, the Mitchell family finally retreated, joining neighbors at the creek. Caldwell alone remained at his homestead, making methodical final preparations inside his limestone perimeter. The outer ground had been thoroughly soaked along the wall's base, creating a steam barrier against ground-level flames. Metal shields were positioned to protect wooden window frames, and wet burlap covered the cabin roof. Most crucially, 8 strategically placed barrels provided water reserves for fighting any spot fires that might breach the main wall. At precisely 1:42 p.m., the fire front reached the western edge of the settlement. The physics of the conflagration exceeded all previous local experience. Flames reached heights of 18 feet, generating temperatures that later calculations estimated at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The sound resembled a continuous freight train, punctuated by explosive popping as vegetation instantly vaporized. Smoke reduced visibility to less than 20 feet, while the fire's convection created wind vortices that flung burning debris in chaotic patterns. Peterson's homestead was the first to burn. His fire breaks proved tragically inadequate as flames simply leaped across the 40-foot gaps. The wooden cabin ignited from multiple ember strikes simultaneously, collapsing within 8 minutes despite its substantial construction. Harrison's property lasted 12 minutes longer, its hybrid defenses temporarily slowing the fire's advance, but ultimately failing against the sustained heat and ember attack. Mitchell's elaborate system performed marginally better, with his main cabin surviving 26 minutes before succumbing to a roof fire ignited by wind-driven embers. At 2:05 p.m., the main fire front reached Caldwell's limestone wall. The barrier performed precisely as designed, blocking direct flame contact completely. Surface temperatures on the exterior face reached 670 degrees, while the interior face remained below 300 degrees, hot to touch but well below ignition points for wooden structures. The 5-foot height prevented 95% of embers from crossing, while the few that did were quickly extinguished by Caldwell using reserved water supplies. Most dramatically, the wall created a thermal shadow extending approximately 40 feet into the property, where temperatures remained below 150 degrees, despite the inferno raging just yards away. This protected zone allowed Caldwell to move safely while monitoring for spot fires, maintaining effective defense throughout the 28-minute direct exposure to the main fire front. By 2:40 p.m., the primary danger had passed, though Caldwell continued vigilance against lingering spot fires for hours afterward. When displaced families returned the following morning to assess damage, they found a stark dividing line between total devastation and survival. Outside Caldwell's wall lay a blackened wasteland extending to every horizon. Inside stood intact structures, surviving livestock, and the only functioning well in the entire settlement. The winter of 1858-1859 transformed Cedar Flats settlement as families rebuilt with hard-earned wisdom about prairie fire defense. Technical analysis of the October conflagration provided compelling evidence that would reshape construction practices throughout the region. Government surveyors documented that fire temperatures had reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit during peak intensity, with flame heights consistently measuring 16 to 18 feet, conditions that exceeded all historical records for the territory. Under these extreme parameters, Caldwell's limestone wall had maintained structural integrity with zero breaches, demonstrating heat dissipation properties that prevented interior temperatures from exceeding 300 degrees Fahrenheit, even during direct flame contact. Edward Peterson, rebuilding his homestead from ashes, incorporated Caldwell's specifications with religious precision. His new 3-foot thick, 5-foot high limestone barrier required 14 weeks of construction, but represented an investment measured against total loss. "I calculated the economics differently now," Peterson explained to visitors. 1 year of agricultural delay versus complete destruction every decade isn't really a choice at all. Most significantly, his calculations showed that the 17 tons of limestone required for adequate protection cost substantially less than replacing all wooden structures even once during a homestead's lifetime. Frederick Jansen synthesized Caldwell's approach with techniques from his Dutch homeland, creating a hybrid system that combined limestone walls with water retention trenches. The interconnected defensive measures provided redundancy against both direct flame contact and ember projection. By spring 1859, Jansen had conducted workshop demonstrations for 28 families, showing how proper mortar composition improved heat resistance and how strategic wall placement could protect multiple structures simultaneously. James Mitchell, whose elaborate conventional defenses had failed catastrophically, became the most dedicated convert to limestone barrier construction. His redesigned homestead featured walls exceeding Caldwell's original specifications, standing 6 feet high and extending to protect auxiliary structures previously considered expendable. "I've survived 3 previous prairie fires using traditional methods," Mitchell acknowledged, "but conditions are changing. What worked in the 1840s won't protect us now." William Harrison's leadership position required acknowledging the settlement's collective failure to appreciate Caldwell's foresight. During the community's spring planning meeting, Harrison formally documented how conventional wisdom had nearly destroyed the entire settlement. His newly established building guidelines incorporated minimum stone barrier requirements for all homesteads within the territory. 17 families lost everything because we prioritized immediate convenience over proven protection, Harrison stated. "That mistake won't happen twice under my leadership." Knowledge transfer accelerated throughout 1859 as Caldwell documented his construction techniques in a 50-page manual that circulated among settlements across Nebraska Territory. The illustrated guide included precise specifications for wall dimensions, stone selection criteria, mortar composition, and strategic placement relative to structures requiring protection. Most significantly, it provided mathematical formulas for calculating minimum wall heights based on surrounding vegetation types and anticipated flame lengths. Science-based planning that transformed intuitive building practices into systematic fire defense. By 1860, territorial government reports noted dramatic changes in construction patterns throughout the eastern Nebraska region. 23 settlements had established building ordinances requiring limestone fire barriers for all new construction. Property values reflected the new reality, with adequately protected homesteads commanding 35% price premiums over properties with conventional defenses. Insurance companies, newly establishing operations in the territory, offered 40% premium reductions for properties featuring limestone perimeter walls meeting Caldwell's minimum specifications. The spring 1861 fires provided measurable validation of the transformed building practices. 17 protected homesteads within Cedar Flats settlement survived direct fire contact without significant damage, while only 3 structures suffered partial losses due to implementation errors rather than design flaws. Comparable settlements utilizing conventional defenses reported 65% structure loss rates under identical fire conditions, confirming the limestone barrier's superior performance through statistical evidence. By 1865, Caldwell's innovation had spread throughout the Great Plains, profoundly influencing architecture from Nebraska to Kansas and west into Colorado Territory. Federal land management officials formally incorporated stone barrier requirements into homesteading regulations for fire-prone regions, acknowledging through policy what settlers had learned through devastating experience. Agricultural productivity figures demonstrated that initial construction delays were offset by eliminated rebuilding requirements, validating Caldwell's approach as economically sound, despite its higher initial investment. Thomas Caldwell himself never sought recognition for the thousands of lives and homesteads his innovation ultimately saved. When visitors arrived seeking the limestone wall inventor, they found a modest farmer focused on agricultural improvements rather than celebrating past vindication. The most telling evidence of his impact could be seen on the horizon surrounding Cedar Flats by 1865, an unbroken ring of limestone walls standing as silent testimony to how completely conventional wisdom had been overturned. The prairie still burned with seasonal regularity, but flames now stopped at homestead boundaries rather than consuming pioneer dreams.